In this video, we're going to talk about Joseph Smith's DNA. There are some scriptures that say that Joseph Smith was a descendant of Joseph of Egypt. In this video, we're going to look at the DNA information we have about Joseph Smith and see whether that DNA information is consistent with the idea that Joseph Smith could be a descendant of Joseph of Egypt. And what we'll find is that the DNA evidence is consistent with that possibility. So let's take a look at Joseph Smith's DNA. This is a slideshow presentation using material that I've presented before. But we'll look at the information about Joseph Smith's DNA and we'll see whether he could be a descendant of Joseph of Egypt. First, the scriptures say he was. So a few of the scriptures that talk about Joseph Smith being a descendant of Joseph of Egypt, one of them is in Genesis 50:27. This is in the Joseph Smith translation. This is a revelation to Joseph of Egypt, which prophesies about his descendant, Joseph Smith. It says, "A choice seer will I raise up out of the fruit of thy loins." So it indicates that out of Joseph of Egypt's descendants, there will be a seer that comes from the loins of Joseph of Egypt. Also in 2nd Nephi, in the Book of Mormon, chapter 3, verses 14 to 15, this is Lehi recounting a prophecy that Joseph of Egypt made. This was likely found in the brass plates. And Lehi says, "And thus prophesied Joseph, saying, His name shall be called after me, and it shall be after the name of his father." And we do know that Joseph Smith is Joseph Smith Jr. His father was also named Joseph. So in talking about this later descendant, it would be someone named Joseph whose father would also be Joseph. Now, Brigham Young also said that Joseph Smith was a descendant from Joseph of Egypt through Ephraim. Brigham Young particularly indicated that the posterity of Ephraim has become mixed with all the nations of the earth, that Joseph Smith was a pure Ephraimite. We don't know what he meant by pure Ephraimite. But anyway, that's what Brigham Young said. We don't know the source of how he knew that, whether that was a revelation or inspiration he received or not, but that's what he said. Okay, so the question is, well, does the science support the idea that Joseph Smith descended from Joseph of Egypt? The first main problem is that we don't have much information about Joseph of Egypt and who he was historically. Most scholars reject the idea that Joseph of Egypt was real. In a separate video, I will discuss the evidence about his existence, showing that there is evidence in Egypt for that seems to show that Joseph of Egypt was real, did exist. But anyway, that'll be in a separate video. Okay, now DNA testing was done on Joseph Smith's descendants through the variety of testing that was done. This was done by Dr. Hugo Perego, and he reported, and this was in 2008, and this, this made the news. But anyway, he reported that Joseph Smith was most likely of Irish descent on the paternal line based on the DNA, whereas the maternal line was a common European female lineage. And so this is kind of the only information that was given out, and just this idea that Joseph Smith, Irish descent, which was not too much of a surprise. Now, there is more information that was provided if you dig through it. In particular, the details showed that Joseph Smith's patrilineal line was Y-DNA Haplogroup R, specifically R1b, 1b, 2a, 2e. So we know the patrilineal Y-DNA type he was, which is that Y-DNA Haplogroup R. On the female side, the matrilineal side, through his mother's line, that was mitochondrial DNA Haplogroup H. And then he also had a DNA marker that some think may relate him to a 5th century Irish king called known as Niall of the Nine Hostages. The association of that marker with that Irish king is disputed somewhat, but that is he had that marker. It may show that connection as well. So let's learn a little bit more about the DNA types that were found, the Y-DNA-R and the mitochondrial haplogroup H. What do we know about those? What does that mean? Okay, so for Y-DNA haplogroup R, it is mostly a European type lineage. The R1b is very common in Western Europe. Now, another place it is very common is among Native Americans, particularly Algonquin tribes in Northeast North America. And then it's also found in other locations as well. Now, in particular, the R1b type is concentrated in Western Europe. On the female side, the matrilineal side through his mother, that's mitochondrial DNA haplogroup H. That is also, as Dr. Perego said, a common European lineage. What's interesting, though, is that the DNA shows a connection. Joseph Smith's DNA shows a connection to both Middle Eastern and Native American DNA types. So let me show this. As mentioned before, that Y-DNA haplogroup R is actually very common among Native Americans, particularly in the Eastern North American area. As you can see, very high concentrations in part. So it shows up in these Algonquin tribes at surprisingly high level, much higher than would be expected to just come from intermixture with Columbus. So I've done separate videos on the Y-DNA, this patrilineal DNA for Native Americans that you may be interested in. Go back and look at my prior DNA videos. But what's interesting is that not only does this Y-DNA haplogroup R, it shows a possible European connection, but it also shows a possible Middle Eastern connection because this is also a DNA type that is found in the Middle East. And then the fact that Joseph Smith is of this DNA type shows a potential DNA connection to Native Americans. Both of the two DNA types that Joseph Smith tested as, the mitochondrial DNA haplogroup H and the Y-DNA R1b, they're both DNA types that, while they're most common in Europe, they are found in the Middle East. So as you see down here, it's a significant percentage of those in the Middle East that have this DNA type, both for each of them, both on the Y-DNA side and on the female side, the mitochondrial DNA side. So these are DNA types that are found among Hebrew populations and in the Middle East as well. Now, an interesting thing is that Middle Eastern and European DNA are actually closely related. They're quite similar. So in autosomal DNA testing, when they look at the markers that show commonalities, what they find is while there are more differences with African DNA types, there's more differences with the East Asian DNA types, but among Europe and Middle East and Central Asia, there are significant similarities in the DNA, common markers, which show that this ancient Hebrew, this is one of the things that shows that ancient Hebrew DNA is actually a Caucasian type DNA that's found common in the Middle East, Europe, and in Central Asia. And I have prior videos that do much more justice on that issue, looking at the autosomal DNA. Now, the DNA types, as indicated for Joseph Smith, more immediately, he's of Irish ancestry. And now what's interesting is that in DNA testing of ancient Irish people, it shows a partial Middle Eastern ancestry for Irish people. And there's the citation on that about how Irish DNA originated in Middle East and in Eastern Europe, shows potential migrations to Ireland from the Middle East. So what this raises is the possibility that this DNA type where it says Joseph Smith is an Irish DNA type. Well, it's a DNA type that's found not only in Ireland, but also in the Middle East. And it opens up the possibility of this DNA showing this connection of people from the Middle East, potentially lost tribes of Israel, potentially tribe of Ephraim, for example, going to Ireland, some of the ancient Irish people having a connection there, which Joseph Smith is a descendant of. So it opens up that possibility of being of the descendant of Joseph of Egypt through the tribe of Ephraim, just like the scriptures and Brigham Young said. And it's showing up in the DNA, which shows up both in the Middle East and then in Ireland, and is also found in Native Americans, which the Book of Mormon shows us are also descendants of Joseph. Native Americans, according to the Book of Mormon, from Joseph through the line of Manasseh, whereas Joseph Smith would be through the line of Ephraim, Joseph of Egypt's other son, who would have the same DNA type. Both Manasseh and Ephraim would have the same DNA type as sons of, on the Y-DNA side, as sons of Joseph of Egypt. So it's interesting that Joseph Smith has that Y-DNA type, and you have many Algonquin Native Americans who have that same Y-DNA type as well. As indicated by Brigham Young, he felt the posterity of Ephraim was mixed throughout the nations. Joseph Smith was a pure Ephraimite. Okay, so then that leads to two conclusions. The first is that Joseph Smith, the question was, does science support the idea that Joseph Smith could be a descendant of Joseph of Egypt? And the answer is yes, that's possible, that the Joseph Smith's DNA is a type that could come from Joseph of Egypt. And then the second conclusion is that the fact that Joseph Smith's DNA type is connected both to the Middle East through Ireland and is also connected to similar DNA types in the Algonquin tribes, it shows a possible connection of Native Americans to Joseph Smith and to the Middle East, a possible indication of an ancestry that fits this scriptural story. All right, let me go ahead and stop the share there. Okay, if you have questions or comments, let me know. To me, it's something that is not conclusive in that it doesn't prove that Joseph Smith was a descendant of Joseph of Egypt. That's because we don't know what Joseph of Egypt's DNA type was. There's no body that's been found for Joseph of Egypt, so we don't have that. But what we do have is DNA evidence that shows that it's entirely possible. All right, so I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.